The summer sun beat down on Windsor Castle as tourists from around the world gathered to admire the historic landmark. Among the sea of visitors taking photos and following tour guides, 3 American tourists stood out, not for their matching Hawaiian shirts or oversized cameras, but for the red flush of alcohol on their faces and their increasingly loud behavior. Sarah Mitchell stood at attention at her post, her red uniform pristine and her black bearskin cap perfectly positioned. At 28, she was one of only 5 female royal guards currently serving at Windsor Castle. The weight of her ceremonial rifle felt familiar against her shoulder as she maintained her stoic expression, something she had perfected during her 3 years of service. "Oh man, look at that. They actually have a lady guard." Brad Thompson, a 25-year-old tech startup employee from California, nudged his friends while pointing at Sarah. His companions, Mike Collins and Tom Baker, both wearing matching grins, stumbled slightly as they turned to look. The 3 men had started their day with a pub crawl through London before taking the train to Windsor. "Dude, I've got the most amazing idea for a TikTok video," Mike whispered, though his whisper was loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. He pulled out his phone, already planning the viral content he thought would make them internet famous. Sarah noticed their behavior immediately. After years of standing guard, she had developed a sixth sense for trouble. While most tourists were respectful, occasionally there were those who tried to provoke a reaction. She kept her eyes forward, but her other senses were on high alert as the 3 men moved closer. "Bet you can't make her smile," Tom challenged Brad, who was now walking in an exaggerated manner, mimicking the Royal Guard's formal march. Several other tourists had stopped to watch, some uncomfortable with the growing tension, others already pulling out their phones to record whatever might happen next. A young British couple nearby exchanged worried glances. The woman, Emma Porter, tugged at her husband's sleeve. "James, perhaps we should alert someone," she whispered. But before they could act, the situation began to escalate. Brad approached Sarah, waving his hand in front of her face. "Hello? Anybody home?" he taunted, his words slightly slurred. Sarah remained motionless, though her right index finger discreetly moved to the emergency button hidden within her uniform, a modern addition to the traditional garb that many tourists didn't know existed. Mike and Tom flanked Brad, their previous nervousness replaced by liquid courage. "Hey, I brought some rope from my backpack," Tom announced, pulling out a length of nylon cord he'd packed for his planned hiking trip in Scotland later that week. "Wouldn't it be hilarious if—" The surrounding tourists began to murmur as the 3 men circled Sarah. Some walked away quickly, not wanting to witness what might happen next. Others stood frozen, phones recording, creating an unwitting record of what would soon become an international incident. Sarah's military training kicked in as she assessed the situation. She could have broken her stance and defended herself. She was more than capable, having excelled in combat training. However, she knew that maintaining protocol would lead to a more decisive response. The moment she had pressed the emergency button, silent alarms had alerted every guard and security officer in the vicinity. "This is going to get 1 million views," Mike exclaimed, his phone held high as Tom began to unravel the rope. Brad, emboldened by the attention they were drawing, stepped even closer to Sarah. What the 3 inebriated tourists failed to notice was the subtle movement of uniformed figures in their peripheral vision. Royal Guards were known for standing still, but they were far from stationary decorations. They were highly trained military personnel, and right now, they were moving into position with practiced precision. The elderly tour guide standing nearby, Mrs. Patricia Hawthorne, had been conducting Windsor Castle tours for over 2 decades. She'd seen her share of tourist misbehavior, but something about these 3 men made her blood run cold. She quickly began ushering her group away from the area, recognizing the signs of an impending security response. As Tom raised the rope with unsteady hands, Brad laughed and pulled out his own phone to get a second angle. "This is going to be epic," he declared, completely oblivious to the fact that multiple armed guards were now silently converging on their position. Sarah Mitchell remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. But beneath her stoic exterior, she knew that what would happen next would teach these tourists a lesson they'd never forget. The rope felt rough against Tom's sweaty palms as he approached Sarah Mitchell from behind. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the castle grounds, and the crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their faces showing a mix of horror and disbelief. "Quick, grab her arms," Brad called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Mike fumbled with his phone, trying to keep it steady while moving into position. The alcohol in their systems had completely destroyed any sense of consequence or proper judgment. Sarah could feel her heart racing, but years of military discipline kept her exterior calm. She had faced challenging situations before, training exercises in harsh conditions, grueling drills, and countless hours of standing guard in all weather. But this was different. This was a direct challenge to everything the Royal Guard represented. As Tom and Brad moved to either side of her, Sarah maintained her forward gaze. Her finger remained on the emergency button, which she had already pressed. She knew that help was less than 2 minutes away, the standard response time for any security threat at Windsor Castle. "This is going to be epic," Mike slurred, zooming in with his camera. "The internet is going to love this." Several tourists had begun to actively protest. A middle-aged woman from Leeds stepped forward, her voice sharp with anger. "Stop this right now. You should be ashamed of yourselves." But her words only seemed to encourage the three Americans, who were now committed to their foolish plan. With clumsy movements, Tom began to wrap the rope around Sarah's torso, binding her arms to her sides. The red uniform, which had been immaculately pressed that morning, wrinkled under the tight cord. Brad helped secure the knots, while Mike captured everything on video, providing running commentary. "Look at her. She can't even move now." Brad laughed, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "Best tourist photo ever." What they didn't notice was the subtle change in the atmosphere around them. The regular castle guards, dressed in plain clothes and blending in with the tourists, had already started clearing the area. Families with children were quietly being directed away, and a perimeter was being established. James Porter, the British man who had witnessed the beginning of the incident, had managed to alert a plainclothes security officer. "Those men," he whispered urgently, "they're assaulting the guard." The officer nodded grimly, speaking quietly into his concealed radio. Sarah felt the ropes tighten as Tom made the final knot. She was now securely tied to the decorative lamppost that had been part of her post for the day. The weight of her ceremonial rifle, still perfectly positioned on her shoulder, began to strain against her bound arms. "Hey lady, why so serious?" Brad taunted, making faces at her. "Come on, just one little smile for TikTok." The surrounding crowd had thinned considerably, though those remaining continued to record the scene on their phones. What appeared to be random tourist movement was actually a carefully coordinated security response, creating clear lines of sight for what was about to happen. Mrs. Hawthorne, the tour guide, had positioned her group at a safe distance. With over 20 years of experience at Windsor Castle, she recognized the telltale signs of an imminent security intervention. She could see the hidden earpieces on several tourists nearby and the way they moved with military precision despite their casual clothing. Mike, still filming, started doing a mock news report. "Breaking news from Windsor Castle. We've captured one of the Queen's guards. Let's see if she can stay serious now." His words were slightly slurred, but his grip on the phone remained steady, determined to capture every moment. The rope bit into Sarah's uniform, but she didn't flinch. Her training had prepared her for much worse, and she knew that in moments, this situation would be resolved. Through her peripheral vision, she could see the positions of her fellow guards, now strategically placed around the area. Tom stepped back to admire their handiwork, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Man, this is going to get so many likes," he said, pulling out his own phone to take selfies with their captive guard. The three Americans, caught up in their perceived triumph, failed to notice that they were now essentially alone in what had been a crowded space moments before. The remaining onlookers stood at a careful distance, their phones still recording, about to capture something very different from what the three troublemakers had planned. Sarah Mitchell remained motionless, her expression unchanged, but beneath her stoic exterior, she could hear the subtle clicks of weapons being readied, and she knew that justice was about to be served. The transformation happened in an instant. Like a well-choreographed dance, 12 royal guards emerged simultaneously from different directions, their red uniforms and black bearskin caps appearing as if from nowhere. The tourists who had been casually taking photos moments before revealed themselves as highly trained military personnel, dropping their civilian disguises. Brad, Mike, and Tom's laughter died in their throats as they found themselves surrounded. The guards moved with precise, synchronized steps, their rifles held at the ready. The ceremonial weapons, usually just for show, now carried an unmistakable air of authority. "Nobody move." The command came from Sergeant James Wilson, his voice cutting through the sudden silence. The three Americans froze, their phones still recording, capturing their own downfall instead of their intended prank. Sarah Mitchell remained perfectly still, though a slight smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She had served with these men and women for 3 years, trained alongside them, and knew exactly how efficiently they would handle this situation. "Drop your phones. Now," another guard ordered. The devices clattered to the ground, screens cracking on impact. Mike made a weak sound of protest but was silenced by the stern faces surrounding him. 2 guards quickly moved to untie Sarah while keeping their colleagues covered. The ropes fell away, and she smoothly resumed her proper stance, never having lost her composure. The only sign of the ordeal was the slight wrinkling of her uniform where the ropes had been. "On your knees, hands behind your heads." Sergeant Wilson's command left no room for argument. Brad, Mike, and Tom clumsily complied, their alcohol-addled brains finally registering the severity of their situation. Mrs. Hawthorne, still watching from a safe distance with her tour group, nodded in satisfaction. "And that, ladies and gentlemen," she whispered to her wide-eyed tourists, "is why one never interferes with the Queen's Guard." Castle security personnel in regular uniforms arrived moments later, accompanied by local police officers. The 3 Americans were quickly handcuffed, their protests falling on deaf ears. Their earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by growing panic as reality set in. "Do you know what you've done?" a police officer asked them sternly. "You've assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard. This is a serious military offense." Brad, suddenly looking very sober, tried to explain. "It was just a joke, man. For social media, we didn't mean any harm." Assaulting a royal guard, restricting the movement of military personnel on active duty, and causing a security incident at a royal residence, the officer listed off. "I assure you, none of this is just a joke." The confiscated phones were carefully bagged as evidence, along with the rope used to tie Sarah. Crime scene photographers documented everything, creating an official record of the incident that would soon make international headlines. Sarah was approached by her commanding officer, Captain Michael Thompson. "Guard Mitchell, are you all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir," she responded crisply. "No harm done, sir." "Excellent work maintaining your post, Mitchell. Her Majesty's Guard performed admirably today." The captain's words carried extra weight. Praise was rare in their service. The remaining tourists who had witnessed the incident were being interviewed by police, their phone recordings collected as additional evidence. Emma and James Porter, who had first raised the alarm, provided their statements, describing how the situation had escalated. As the 3 Americans were led away, their faces now pale and worried, Tom turned back for one last look at Sarah. She stood at her post, as straight and dignified as ever, showing no sign of the ordeal she had just endured. "The American embassy will be notified," one officer informed them as they were escorted to waiting police vehicles. "Until then, they'll be held in custody." The castle grounds gradually returned to normal. Tourists resumed their tours, now with an added story to tell when they returned home. Mrs. Hawthorne's tour group buzzed with excited whispers, having witnessed firsthand the efficiency and precision of Windsor Castle's security. Sarah Mitchell continued her watch, standing proud at her post. The incident had demonstrated why the Royal Guard was more than just a tourist attraction. They were highly trained military personnel, ready to respond to any threat with swift, coordinated action. As the sun continued its journey across the sky, casting new shadows across the ancient castle walls, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The system had worked perfectly, from the silent alarm to the coordinated response. It was a reminder to all that behind the ceremonial uniforms and strict traditions, the Royal Guard remained a formidable military force. Inside Windsor Police Station, the 3 American tourists sat in separate holding cells, their Hawaiian shirts now wrinkled and their earlier cockiness completely gone. The cold reality of their situation had finally penetrated through their alcoholic haze. Detective Inspector Rachel Thompson sat at her desk, reviewing the footage collected from various tourist phones. The videos showed multiple angles of the incident, each one making their case stronger. On her computer screen, she watched as Brad, Mike, and Tom laughed while tying Sarah Mitchell to the lamppost. "They've made quite a mess for themselves," said Sergeant Peters, standing beside her desk. "The military police want jurisdiction, and the palace is involved now." In another room, Brad sat across from two stern-faced officials, one from the British military police and another from the American embassy. His hands trembled as he tried to explain himself. "Listen, we were just trying to make a funny video." Brad's voice cracked. "We didn't know it was such a big deal." "Mr. Thompson," the embassy official spoke firmly, "you assaulted a member of the British Armed Forces while she was on active duty protecting a royal residence. This isn't like disrupting a street performer in Times Square." Meanwhile, Tom was being interviewed by Detective Inspector Thompson herself. The gravity of the situation had sobered him completely, and tears streamed down his face as she played back the video evidence. "Do you understand that Guard Mitchell is not a tourist attraction?" Thompson asked. "She's a decorated soldier with multiple commendations for service." In the third interview room, Mike sat silently as his social media accounts were being examined. His phone, though cracked from being dropped, had automatically uploaded the video to his cloud storage. The technical team was now downloading everything related to the incident. Back at Windsor Castle, Sarah Mitchell had been relieved of her post and was giving her official statement to military investigators. Her commanding officer, Captain Thompson, sat nearby as she detailed the events with military precision. "They approached from the west side of the post," Sarah explained, her voice steady. "I activated the emergency signal as soon as they displayed hostile intent. The investigation was moving at an unprecedented speed. Within hours, the case had caught the attention of senior military officials and government authorities. The implications of foreign nationals assaulting a royal guard had diplomatic ramifications. In London, at the American embassy, officials were scrambling to handle the situation. The ambassador himself had been briefed, knowing this incident could potentially strain relations between the two nations if not handled properly. "We need to make it clear that these individuals' actions do not reflect American values or respect for British institutions," the ambassador told his staff. "Full cooperation with British authorities is our priority." Back at the police station, Detective Inspector Thompson compiled the growing evidence. Besides the video footage, they had statements from 28 witnesses, including Mrs. Hawthorne, the tour guide whose testimony carried particular weight given her 2 decades of service at Windsor Castle. The rope they used, Sergeant Peters reported, was new. They bought it that morning from an outdoor shop in London. "We have the receipt and CCTV footage from the store." The three Americans were not permitted to communicate with each other, but their separate interviews revealed a consistent pattern, a day of drinking that led to increasingly poor decisions, culminating in their ill-conceived prank. By evening, the story had leaked to the press. News vans gathered outside Windsor Castle, where Sarah Mitchell's empty post had become a point of interest for curious onlookers. The first online articles appeared, their headlines screaming about the disrespect shown to a female royal guard. In the holding cells, Brad, Mike, and Tom faced their first night in custody. Their phones, passports, and belongings had been confiscated. The reality of their situation was crushing. They weren't going back to their hotel tonight, or anytime soon. Sarah Mitchell, having completed her statements, returned to the guards' quarters. Her fellow guards greeted her with respectful nods, their usual stoic demeanors softened by concern for their colleague. "You handled it perfectly, Mitchell," her roommate, Guard Jessica Lewis, told her. "Showed them what the guard is really made of." As night fell over Windsor Castle, the incident had become more than just a case of tourist misbehavior. It had evolved into a statement about respect, duty, and the consequences of treating British institutions as mere entertainment. The three Americans would soon learn that their attempt at social media fame would cost them far more than they could have imagined. The courtroom at Westminster Magistrates' Court fell silent as Brad, Mike, and Tom were led in, wearing identical gray prison jumpsuits. Gone were their Hawaiian shirts and carefree smiles, replaced by pale faces and nervous glances. After spending 5 days in custody, the reality of their situation had fully sunk in. Judge Margaret Blackwood studied the documents before her, her expression stern. The case had attracted significant media attention, with reporters filling the public gallery. Outside, news cameras lined the street, waiting to capture any glimpse of the three Americans who had dared to assault a royal guard. "The charges before this court are serious," Judge Blackwood began. "Assault of a military officer on active duty, causing a security incident at a royal residence, and attempting to obstruct a guard in performance of their duties." The prosecution presented their evidence methodically. The videos, now seen by millions online, played on the courtroom screens. Sarah Mitchell sat in the witness box, her red ceremonial uniform replaced by formal military dress, as she provided her testimony. "I maintained my position as per protocol," Sarah stated clearly. "The emergency response system worked exactly as DZ. The defendant's lawyer, Mr. James Henderson, tried his best to minimize the damage. Your Honor, my clients recognized the severe lapse in advance. They chose their target deliberately. They filmed their actions with the intent to publish and profit from them." Throughout the proceedings, various witnesses took the stand. Mrs. Hawthorne, the tour guide, provided particularly damaging testimony about the premeditated nature of the attack. The embassy official who had first interviewed them also spoke about their initial lack of remorse. During a break in proceedings, Brad turned to his parents, who had flown in from California. "Mom, I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't think it would turn out like this." His mother wiped tears from her eyes while his father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched in disappointment. The technical evidence was overwhelming. Besides the viral videos, prosecutors presented the defendant's social media history, showing a pattern of increasingly risky pranks designed to gain followers. Their online comments about planning to mess with the royal guard were particularly damaging. "The Crown views this not merely as an assault on Guard Mitchell," Prosecutor Chen continued, "but as an attack on a fundamental British institution. The defendant sought to humiliate a soldier performing her sworn duty." Mike's father, a retired military officer himself, sat with his head bowed. The family's military background made his son's actions particularly shameful. Tom's sister, a social media influencer who had flown in from New York, watched in horror as her brother's attempt at viral fame unraveled into an international incident. When Judge Blackwood called for impact statements, Sarah Mitchell's commanding officer, Captain Thompson, stepped forward. "The Royal Guard represents centuries of tradition and dedication to duty. This incident has implications far beyond a simple assault." The defense tried to argue for leniency based on the defendant's clean prior records and their youth. "They are prepared to make full restitution, Your Honor," Mr. Henderson pleaded. "They understand the gravity of their actions and are willing to issue public apologies." But the prosecution countered with statements from military experts about the serious nature of interfering with a guard on active duty. They also presented diplomatic notes expressing concern about the precedent this case would set. As the proceedings neared their end, each defendant was given a chance to speak. Brad went first, his voice trembling. "I never meant to disrespect your country or your military. I was stupid and thoughtless." Mike and Tom offered similar apologies, but their words seemed hollow against the weight of evidence showing their deliberate planning and gleeful execution of the prank. Judge Blackwood listened to all statements carefully, her expression unchanging. The courtroom tensed as she prepared to deliver her verdict. The case had become more than just a matter of law. It was about respect for institutions, international relations, and the changing nature of social media culture. As she began to speak, the three Americans stood nervously, knowing their immediate future hung on her next words. The sentence would need to satisfy both justice and public interest, while sending a clear message about the consequences of treating British institutions as props for social media entertainment. The headline flashed across screens worldwide: "American tourists found guilty. 6 months in prison for Royal Guard attack." The verdict sent shockwaves through social media, diplomatic circles, and tourist communities globally. Inside the American Embassy in London, Ambassador Richard Stevens faced a room full of journalists. The high-ceilinged press room buzzed with tension as reporters from various countries waited for his statement. "The United States respects the British court's decision," the ambassador began, his voice firm. "The actions of these three individuals do not reflect American values or our deep respect for British institutions and traditions." Meanwhile, in California, Brad's startup company issued a public statement announcing his immediate termination. their guides to include specific warnings about respecting military personnel at tourist sites. Airlines began playing informational videos about appropriate behavior at historical landmarks. In British Parliament, MPs debated new legislation to increase penalties for interfering with ceremonial guards. The incident had exposed a gap in existing laws, and there was strong support for creating stricter deterrents. Sarah Mitchell's story took on a life of its own. Women's military organizations celebrated her professionalism under pressure. Young girls wrote letters to Windsor Castle, expressing their admiration for her strength and dignity. However, she remained focused on her duties, declining interviews and continuing her service with characteristic dedication. The prison where Brad, Mike, and Tom would serve their sentences received numerous media inquiries. The three Americans would be held in HMP Wandsworth, a historic prison in London. Their legal team's appeals for transfer to a minimum security facility had been denied. This case sets an important precedent. Legal expert Victoria Hammond explained on BBC News. It shows that social media fame-seeking will not be considered a mitigating factor in serious offences against British institutions. International tourism organizations scrambled to update their guidelines. The World Tourism Council issued new recommendations for behavioral standards at historical sites and military installations. Major tour companies added specific clauses to their contracts about respecting ceremonial guards. The viral videos of the incident, though widely shared initially, began disappearing from social platforms as companies faced pressure to remove content showing disrespect to military personnel. Digital rights groups debated the implications of this content moderation. Back in the United States, the families faced their own challenges. Brad's parents received hate mail from military families. Mike's father's military colleagues distanced themselves, some returning Christmas cards unopened. Tom's sister lost several sponsorship deals as brands worried about association with her family. The U.S. State Department updated its travel advisories for the United Kingdom, adding specific warnings about appropriate behavior around ceremonial guards. American universities with study abroad programs incorporated new cultural sensitivity training. In Windsor Castle, subtle changes appeared. Additional security cameras were installed, and plainclothes officers increased their presence around guard posts. The tourists still came in crowds, but there was a noticeable change in their behavior. More respectful, more distant. Mrs. Hawthorne, the tour guide, found herself adding a new segment to her tours. The guards are not entertainers, she would tell her groups firmly. They are soldiers performing a duty that dates back centuries. The diplomatic fallout continued as British and American officials worked to prevent the incident from affecting broader relations. Trade negotiations and military cooperation meetings now sometimes began with awkward jokes about keeping guards untied. As the three Americans began their prison sentences, their case became a cautionary tale. Social media influencers referenced it when discussing responsible content creation. Tourism schools included it in their curriculum. Military academies used it to teach about maintaining composure under provocation. Sarah Mitchell continued her duties, standing guard at Windsor Castle. Tourists still took photos, but now they maintained a respectful distance. Some would point and whisper, recognizing her from the news, but she remained as she had always been, professional, dignified, and unwavering in her duty. 6 months passed quickly. On a cold January morning, Brad, Mike, and Tom were released from HMP Wandsworth Prison, looking thinner and much more subdued than when they entered. They were immediately taken to Heathrow Airport, where 3 separate flights awaited to take them back to the United States. "You are now banned from entering the United Kingdom for life," the immigration officer informed them as they surrendered their stamped documents. "Any attempt to return will result in immediate arrest." Sarah Mitchell's life had changed significantly during those months. Her unwavering composure during the incident had caught the attention of senior military leadership. She now stood in Buckingham Palace's Grand Ballroom, her uniform pristine, waiting to receive a special commendation for her service. Guard Mitchell demonstrated extraordinary discipline and professionalism, the citation read. Her actions upheld the highest traditions of the King's Guard. The ceremony was attended by high-ranking military officials and, surprisingly, the American ambassador who had requested to be present. Back in America, the 3 former tourists faced their new reality. Brad's tech career was effectively over. No company would risk hiring him. He moved back to his parents' house and started working at his father's hardware store, avoiding social media entirely. Mike, perhaps I'm. Tom's sister had transformed her social media presence, becoming an advocate for responsible tourism and cultural respect. Her brother worked with her, speaking at colleges about how the pursuit of viral fame had nearly ruined his life. Mrs. Hawthorne retired from her tour guide position but was invited to help train new guides. Her orientation now included a powerful segment about the incident, using it to teach about respect for tradition and duty. At Windsor Castle, a subtle change had occurred in how visitors interacted with the guards. Tourists still took photos, but there was a new atmosphere of respect. Parents could be heard teaching their children about the guards' real military role and the importance of showing proper respect. Sarah Mitchell's story became part of Royal Guard training. New recruits learned about how she had followed protocol perfectly, using the emergency signal system while maintaining her post. Her actions were cited as a prime example of the Guard's core values. The incident had lasting effects on social media platforms. New algorithms were developed to flag and review content showing disrespect to military personnel or historical sites. The phrase, "don't pull a Windsor," became internet slang for taking things too far for social media attention. 1 year after the incident, Sarah received a promotion. During the ceremony, her commanding officer spoke about how her actions had strengthened the Guard's reputation. Guard Mitchell showed the world that our ceremonial duties are backed by real military discipline and pride, he declared. The three Americans tried to move forward with their lives. Their story appeared in documentaries about social media culture and its dangers. Brad eventually wrote a book about his experience, donating the proceeds to veterans organizations. Mike excelled in his military training, driven by a need to redeem himself. Tom worked with his sister to create educational content about respectful tourism. Windsor Castle added a new section to its visitor center, explaining the role and importance of the King's Guard. A small plaque, installed near Sarah's former post, reminded visitors that the guards were active duty soldiers deserving of respect. The diplomatic tensions eventually eased, but the incident left a lasting mark on British-American relations. Tourism companies now included specific behavioral guidelines in their packages, and American schools added cultural sensitivity modules to their study abroad orientations. Sarah Mitchell continued her service with the same dedication that had defined her actions that summer day. She occasionally caught glimpses of herself in tourism books and military training materials, but remained focused on her duties. On the anniversary of the incident, Sarah stood at her post, as straight and proud as ever. A young American girl approached with her parents, stopping at a respectful distance. "Thank you for your service," the girl said softly, offering a small salute. Sarah maintained her position, but her eyes softened slightly. This was the real legacy of that infamous day, not the viral videos or international headlines, but a new understanding of respect, duty, and the honor of service. The incident had become more than just a cautionary tale. It had transformed into a lesson about respect, responsibility, and the unexpected consequences of treating serious institutions as entertainment. The Royal Guard stood stronger for it, their dignity and purpose understood anew by visitors from around the world.